I wish you luck in that
go-to example.
Adventure of a question. I find it a little uninteresting, but
Sorry, I just had flashbacks to my worst moments of grad seminars.
No. It wasn't a dig on you. Welcome to Cult Favorites, the podcast that contains hidden cocktail recipes if you play the episode backwards. I'm Merinda Simmons.
And I'm Mike Altman. We are, what are we?
I do like a good cocktail recipe, that's all.
I know.
Maybe lots of things are hidden in our episodes if you play them backwards. Who knows?
Yeah.
We wouldn't know.
No, I've never played it backwards. I don't even know how to do that. That's not an option on Spotify.
Are we, Mike?
Spotify needs a backwards option. I want it. There's people like, because you know those people who listen. Are you one of those people who listen to podcasts on 1.5 speed?
No.
Audience members out there.
No.
Are you listening to this on 1.5 speed?
I do sometimes listen to audio messages from friends at 1.5 speed, depending.
Yeah, you introduced me to the audio message. I never did that before.
Yeah, sometimes I send you those. Do you need help? We are two religious studies professors who are trying to understand all of these cult documentaries that you can't stop binge watching. And we have a Halloween special today, but I'll let you do the support line.
Yes, if you want to support the show and help more people find us and listen to us backwards, you can follow us on all of the socials at Cult Favorite Pod. Also, be sure to subscribe to the show and leave us a rating and a review. Before we get started, a quick announcement. We are entering conference season and
holiday season. It's a season.
And finals season and
grading
and season.
Sharing, caring, and being truly busy.
Yes. So while this is our big Halloween episode, we are also going to take a little respite, a little time. So we're going to shift to a every 2-week schedule. So we'll be back
November 11th.
And then we're going to do every couple weeks, and then we'll probably take a break.
Do you want to tell?
In December.
Do you want to say what we're going to talk about on the 11th?
Yes.
Because I'm excited about it.
Tell us what we're going to talk about.
We're going to talk about Lula Rich.
Lula Row.
Put on your favorite pair of leggings. Get a cup of cocoa.
I want some leggings.
Settle in, and we'll talk about.
I'm trying to think like what color.
MLMs.
I don't own any leggings. Well, I guess I have like joggers. Or joggers, dude leggings. I don't know. Anyways, that's where we're headed. So we'll see in 2 weeks. But don't wait. Listen to the rest of this episode first.
We have a Halloween special.
We do.
Because it's the week of Halloween.
Yeah.
I'm very excited. And we're going to watch Hell's Bells. It's sort of maybe it's a kind of mockumentary for us. It's a product of its time.
Yeah.
It was made in 1989. And it was by an evangelical Christian who was wanting to make sure that people understood the dangers of heavy metal music. And
that's the subtitle, The Dangers of Rock and Roll.
But first, I have a question for you, Michael.
Okay.
What's a metaphor?
I don't know, Merinda. What's a metaphor?
Cows and sheep, mostly.
Wow. Okay.
But you know what?
Yeah.
I don't think the makers of Hell's Bells know what a metaphor is either.
I think they do. I think they choose when it's a metaphor and when it's not a metaphor.
Perhaps. What did you know about Hell's Bells?
I knew nothing. I knew nothing about this. I knew you were like, hey, there's this thing. And I was like, all right, let's watch it.
I like a theme for a holiday.
How did you find this?
And so I wanted something fun for Halloween.
Yeah. How did you find this?
You're just lucky I didn't ask us both to wear costumes today.
Well, you tried to get me to watch a horror movie. And
I did.
I said no.
Mm-hmm. So someone I know and love who was born in 1973 watched this as part of the youth group in his church.
Oh, okay.
But since I was born in the early 80s, I was very much steeped in the ambient satanic panic that was happening throughout that decade. The stranger danger, that came in the wake in the 90s.
Yeah.
And a lot of grown-ups worrying about the music that we were listening to. So that was very much in my life.
Yeah, this was definitely before my time as more of a mid-80s, being born in the mid-80s.
But you're probably familiar with like the worry and hand-wringing about messages in music?
Yeah, I mean... ...
question mark?
There was some hand-wringing and worrying. Actually, I don't know when I was going to drop this later. There's a sequel, by the way.
6 hours. This one was almost 3 hours.
I pulled it up on YouTube, and it is 6 hours. And I was like, no. But but that sequel, it was 2004. Eric Holmberg is the guy who's made these. That was... that sequel was the ones I was like, oh, I know these. These are the bands I recognize. These are
Marilyn Manson and such.
Yes, all of my nu metal favorites. But this one was music that I still was like into thanks to radio. Like the thing about was like, there was fear about music, but also you had after this comes out, you have the kind of rise of contemporary Christian music and Christian rock and Christian metal that really takes off in the 90s, and so then you have like an alternative little garden to play in.
What I do find interesting is the kind of cultural backlash product to said product. Like the way that we make and consume things based on what we're anxious about.
Yes.
And what we try to supplant those anxieties with that can still scratch the itch.
Yeah.
But can make us feel more relaxed.
Well, and what has happened is that I have these massive holes in my musical knowledge. So like there'll be songs and my partner, we'll hear my partner like, you don't know the words to this? You don't know this song? I'm like, no. Like we didn't listen to pop music in the car growing up. So like anything that most people's parents made them listen to,
oh my God,
did not even get. But you don't know who Sandi Patty is what I say back. She's like, I don't care.
Sandi Patty.
I got some deep cuts.
Well, I am hoping for some Mike lore to make some appearances through this episode. I don't drop a lot of Merinda lore, but I will drop some right now. Are you ready?
Okay.
Because I was really invested in lyrics, and I remember in the 5th grade when all of my friends really, really, really were into New Kids on the Block. And I tried so hard because I wanted to be cool.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it. It was like, I couldn't tell them apart. They all looked the same to me. I couldn't figure out why they were cool and which one was cute and what was all the things that people were talking about. But what I did know was every single word to Don McLean's American Pie.
No, that's good. Yeah.
I don't know if it's good or not, but I thought that like Bob Dylan was a brilliant poet.
Yeah.
And American Pie was like the greatest song in the world. I was listening to a lot of Tracy Chapman at the time, so.
Yeah. Well, no, because of my sheltered is the word, existence, I've always had all this anxiety because all through high school was clawing to actually be cool with my musical taste, even though deep down, like I did enjoy the Wallflowers, but I also wanted to listen to Rancid.
Oh my God.
Like,
do you know what I never enjoyed?
If all you have is the
Wallflowers,
radio,
but I did like Tom Petty's Wallflowers album.
But yeah, this has haunted me. I've never felt cool. I've never been cool when it comes to my musical taste.
I think you're cool, Mike.
No, even now I'm a cliche. I'm like all excited about the new National Live album, and it's like, God,
this is too much pre-gaming. Give us a synopsis.
So the synopsis. Here we go.
I'm sorry for dropping my lore.
No, always drop the lore. That's what listeners want. So this was a 5 parts. This divided into 5 parts, almost 3 hours long. It was originally 2 VHS tapes that your youth pastor had to keep track of. Part 1 is about the power of music, and the main framing, like, logical thing the sort of premise you have to accept for any of this to make sense is the idea that the quote-unquote spiritual world, that is the world of, like, Satan and God, spirits and demons, is the real world, and everything else is sort of being manipulated by that in various ways. And so if you don't accept that premise, then it doesn't work. They go all the way back to Chinese philosophy, and our fearless leader, Eric Holmberg, starts there, and he's sort of just the talking head through all of this.
Wonderful hair.
Wonderful mullet, mustache, looks like
earnest.
Yeah. He looks like everybody I see when I used to look at my parents' pictures from Bible college. Starts with ancient Chinese philosophy about the power of music, and then goes to Plato, quotes Plato about the power of music, and then jumps to modern rock and roll, and then talks about basically there's sort of three parts of the human body, the body, the soul, which is sort of the mind, will, and emotions, and then the spirit, which is the real part. And that rock and roll, which becomes basically all popular music, and then other music that's not really popular music. Like somehow this is both like Whitney Houston and the Sex Pistols, and like, the Plasmatics, like all in one. With Whitney Houston. Yeah, Whitney Houston. She just gets struck in at the end for no reason. The example of how it's bad for your body is they take an egg and put it next to a speaker and play heavy metal music, and it hard boils the egg. And so just think about what it's going to do to your body.
This is your brain on rock.
The soul and the spirit was become evident as we go. And there's a great line about how the Bible and Christian tradition hold that Satan may have been the musical director of heaven before he was kicked out. So there you go. All right. Part 2, the root of rock. And this is built around a reading. Merinda has thoughts on close reading.
I have very strong thoughts.
A particular reading of the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, that they keep pulling verses from the Satanic Bible and just matching them up to stuff. And that's kind of how a lot of the whole documentary goes. So just a quick side note. So Anton LaVey publishes the Satanic Bible in 1969. He was one of the founders of the Church of Satan. LaVey's Satanism, there are various forms of Satanism. LaVey's Satanism is we call it kind of atheist Satanism. So God and Satan are not real beings out there in the world. They're projections of the self. And he's actually borrowing a lot from the human potential movement. So the Satanic Bible that he publishes, actually, he's been accused of plagiarism a lot for it. He's like stole stuff from Ayn Rand. He stole stuff from all sorts of people. And it might have been inspired by Rosemary's Baby, the film that keeps coming up in these things for some reason, where the publisher, after seeing the popularity of Rosemary's Baby, came to LaVey and said, like, hey, why don't you publish like a book we can market around this? The documentary takes verses from the Satanic Bible and then finds examples in rock songs and videos. So in part, the big ones in part 2 are blasphemy, which is just videos mocking Jesus, mocking Christianity. By mocking, they mean like representing in some way that's not orthodox. The crucifixion and all these things. There's also the problem of universalism. So any pop music that has any Buddhist or Christian images is immediately seen as universalistic. And it's just a kind of like laundry list of examples. And then part 3 is the fruit of rock. So you have the root and the fruit. So here, this is just all of the bad things that happen because of satanic music. Violence, crime. There's a bunch of like these stories of young people committing murder, and then because they listened to heavy metal music. He does say at one point, I'm not saying heavy metal music will make you kill your mom," which I guess is something. Suicide, drugs, sex. These are all things that happen because of heavy metal music, and there's just lots and lots of examples, ranging from like hair metal to punk to sort of there were bands that I'd never heard of. Part 4 is the fruit of rock part 2, which is just more bad things. So rebellion is a bad thing. He talks about why Feed the World was actually really bad. And then there's what I thought was the most like fascinating part of all of these was his whole thing on the occult, because it becomes this like catch-all for so much stuff. Like he starts with Robert Johnson and the idea of the crossroads as a kind of like occult beginnings of rock and roll. He talks about Gnosticism. He has a whole thing on voodoo and Jimi Hendrix and David Byrne, and has a line like, I love the moments when people in my household walk by as I'm watching these things, because he just says at one point that like voodoo becomes jazz and rhythm and blues. And one of my teenagers was like, wait, what? And then there's a long thing on Aleister Crowley and his influence and his connections to a variety of rock and roll musicians. There's a story that John Morrison tells about being possessed by Native American spirits that he points to. And then they spend a lot of time on backmasking. So the idea of playing songs backwards to reveal hidden messages. And he kind of makes this division between like two types. Like the one type that is you can tell it's backmasking, like it sounds like gibberish, and then you play it backwards. And he's like, that's just a gimmick that people use to sell stuff. But then there's another kind where it's like it sounds normal, and then you play it backwards, and there's a message. And he's like, that's not intentional. That's actually the power of Satan to go in and manipulate the song so that happens.
Play the musician the way that a musician would play an instrument.
Right. Yes. Exactly. And I think one example was I think it was in Stairway to Heaven. It was in one of the Led Zeppelin songs, I think, where it tells you to start to smoke marijuana.
I mean,
as if you needed it backwards.
There are so many.
As if teenagers in 1989 needed backwards messages to be told to start smoking marijuana. So then we get to the big finish, which is quite predictable if you're aware of this genre of evangelical documentary. The part 5, the axe falls, and this is like the altar call. And basically, it's like, hey. There are two types of people. There's two kingdoms, God's kingdom, Satan's kingdom. If you like rock music, you really don't love God. So if you're listening to this, so here's 2.5 hours of much of it very good music. If you found any of it interesting, you might not really love God.
Or if you're feeling like conviction in your heart and you're feeling unsettled.
Yes. And then there's also, I think, which I was waiting for it to happen, because I think this we can talk more about this in a minute, but like, I think this type of presentation comes out of a particular strand of American evangelicalism that is kind of like reformed and thinks of itself as intellectual. And so there's a low-key predestination of like, you really can't choose to follow God or follow Jesus. God has to like make you choose. To which it's like, well, then what am I even doing here, man? And then it closes with this song and music video called The Dance, about dancing for God. And so I immediately Shazammed this. And found out it was by a guy named Kemper Crabb. It was made in 1982. Crabb has been associated with groups like Caedmon's Call, which is like it was like kind of like evangelical Dave Matthews Band. So that's how it kind of ends. And there is, like I said, there's a sequel, Hell's Bells, to The Power and Spirit of Popular Music, that is 6 hours long. If anyone listens to that, please send me an email and tell me what's good. But that's it.
That's it.
Yeah, I told you I could do it.
Almost 3 hours long was this first incarnation of the documentary.
It didn't feel like it till part 5.
You don't think?
It was fine,
All
but
right.
by the end I was like, I don't want to sit through this. But yeah. What do you want to talk about, Merinda?
All things moral panics, not least among them, should be put in context. This film came out in 1989. So I wanted to give a timeline because it is so much not unlike his aesthetics with his hairstyle and mustache. The film itself is very much, and the ideas contained therein, is very much a product of its time. So in the late 70s is when evangelical pastor Jerry Falwell popularizes like hell houses, offering moral instruction by way of terrorizing teens with the consequences of sin. Those are still a thing, and those typically happen near Halloween. Speaking of,
go find one near you now.
In 1979, with the help of conservative political strategists, Falwell establishes the moral majority, and we see the emergence of the religious right throughout the 80s. I do think that so much of what Hell's Bells is, and so much of what this time period is characterized by an ambient moral panic. And the moral panic that we have about music is so much to do with teenagers and like as a consumer demographic.
Yeah.
New technology is coming out and that kind of freaks us out. There is this political conservative base that's being organized around evangelical Christianity. So not unimportantly, the same year that the moral majority is founded by Falwell is 1979 is also when the first Sony Walkman is released.
Okay.
So new tech for teens is scary and weird because now their parents don't have the same kind of access that they, did to what they're listening to. In 1980, the book Michelle Remembers is published. It becomes a big hit. This is kind of what kicks off the Satanic Panic through the 80s. The Satanic Panic is when like thousands of unsubstantiated allegations of child abuse, specifically child sex abuse, was happening through the 80s, especially by preschools, like allegations about preschool teachers harming children.
Yeah.
People went to jail. Congress doubles the budget for child protection programs in the mid 80s. Like,
which is, and this is also connected, I think, to the Equal Rights Amendment and fears about, well, if women aren't at home with their kids, who is watching them? And the answer is Satanists.
Right. So it peters out in the early and mid 90s. Again, replaced with Stranger Danger for those of us who were kids in the early 80s. It's not coincidentally, PG-13 rating comes out in 1984. Like it's the late 60s that ratings start happening with film. But it is not until the mid 80s that we create this specific space about like parental guidance strongly, whatever. In 1985 is when we see Tipper Gore founding the Parents Music Resource Center. The Senate holds hearings because of the PMRC's work on what they call porn rock.
Oh, wow.
This is when, you see Dee Snider and also John Denver and Frank Zappa come in. Those were the three like major figures of
filthy lyrics of John Denver.
You can watch those hearings on YouTube. They are a very good time. It's like those musicians, of course, are talking about censorship, how people read what they read into their lyrics and why that's about them and not the lyrics themselves or the meaning of the songs. It's very much about artistic integrity and authorial intent. There's so much wrapped up in that, not least of which, though, is severe parental anxiety about what the kids are listening to because the kids are not okay. Around the same time, fears of backmasking emerge. Backmasking is when a message is recorded backward on a track that's played forward. Christians allege that musicians were using this to relay satanic subliminal messages. Yes, Aleister Crowley, who you mentioned before, he had a book where he encouraged magicians in training to listen to things backwards. And so then that became the seed of what's specifically satanic about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on that in the documentary about like Aleister Crowley tells people to walk backwards and eat backwards and read backwards. And
artists were using a lot of like playing things in reverse in order to make interesting sounds in their music. So think of like Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows, that guitar solo loop. That's being played in reverse. But people were worried that messages were also coming through in that way. So I give all of that context to say.
Can I add one more piece of context?
Please do.
In 1980, there were 16 million homes with cable. By 1990, there were 50 million. So in 1981, you have the founding of MTV, which is sort of prevalent in this documentary. So you also have this explosion of new media and new media forms and the incursion of cable into people's homes, which not having cable was a thing that you would hear some evangelicals talking about. The problem being that like ESPN became really important. But yeah, I mean, that's another piece of this.
So musicians and artists have always responded to their societal moment. If you think of the super controversial Piss Christ, there was in 1987. Andre Serrano, like a crucifix was submerged in his urine inside of a container. That was 1987. So it wasn't just on the music scene that this was happening. It makes loads of sense if you think about the last, like what's going on inside of that decade. It makes loads of sense that a young generation, like rebelling against the fundamentalism of a new moral majority, would make use of that satanic panic. Like that's what's going on in society.
Yeah.
That's what they're making use of and also responding to, incorporating its tropes. That seems
obvious.
Super low key and obvious to me. What does not seem super low key and obvious to me, oh man, the many modes of textual criticism in this documentary, the mind reels, Mike. I don't feel like it's very interesting or useful to say, he says this, that's silly because of this, and we should really read it like that. I just am I love this documentary as a product of its moment and placing it inside of that context to talk about bigger ideas. But the mismatch of super vague, sweeping claims, many philosophers have suggested.
Right.
or
just voodoo led to jazz.
But then a lot gets invested in like 2 words or one phrase of a song.
Yeah.
Or this person wears a cross upside down. That like a symbol or a phrase in a song becomes emblematic of this much bigger thing and extrapolated into this much bigger thing. So,
I mean, how else are you going to interpret running with the devil other than you are running
with the devil?
With the devil.
That's why I ask if a metaphor was a familiar, form or tool.
So this is literally what I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
So I don't know if I saw it on a mug or on like Instagram, but I can do all things through a verse taken out of context.
Mm-hmm.
What I enjoyed, what was in here that I noticed was that the way they treat the music and the videos is exactly the way they treat the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have quotes taken out of context. So like, I don't need to know what's actually happening in whatever, epistle of Paul. I can just be like, yeah, women can't talk. Like it says it, right? And then it's a kind of literalism, but it's a particular brand of evangelical literalism that's like allows you to be literal when you want to, but not when you don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are no actual biblical literalists out there. And so there's this the way they read both the Satanic Bible and then the lyrics of the songs or the symbols in the videos or the quotes of people are saying, like when Pete Townsend says that like he has no idea what's happening when he's on stage, like all these things. It is exactly how they treat the Bible, and it's as well as the like connect this to this to this to this to this.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a kind of inductive reasoning
mm-hmm.
where everything you need is in the text, and so we just have to connect. And in this case, the text is like all of pop music, and we can we can connect these things sort of through this logical way. That yes, it sort of pulls them out of context.
Mm-hmm.
It, ignores all of that.
I feel like it's important that all of that does not mean that they are misreading the Bible, misusing
no.
like the thing that we talked about, I think maybe in our last episode, of the tendency or the impulse to say that because this person is doing something with this text or this tradition that doesn't make sense to me,
right?
That is a misconstrual of whatever.
Yeah.
And we do it often with like religious traditions that we like
or
normalize or think are familiar.
Yeah. And I think I would point to an old classic in American church history, George Marsden's book, Fundamentalism in American Culture, which first came out in 1980, where he goes through and sort of traces fundamentalism as an intellectual movement connected back to the kind of inductive reasoning of like Scottish common sense philosophy. Marsden was looked at as an evangelical intellectual of a certain kind, often the kind that found themselves at on the opposite side of arguments with this sort of take, right? So in 1976, Francis Schaeffer, who was a self-styled evangelical intellectual of a particular kind of like reformed tradition as well, he put a video, it's a book and then a series of films called How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture, in which he kind of narrates all of European intellectual history as leading up to a kind of like godless postmodernism.
Mm-hmm. Isn't Francis Schaeffer also the one that did the really popular video about abortion?
Yes, that was my next point. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So in 79, he comes out with Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which is about
I see it now.
which had Surgeon General C. Everett Koop in it, and that was the one about abortion, euthanasia, and infanticide. Schaeffer was sort of the intellectual force that led to the rise of the religious right you're talking about. So he's the one that's really shaping abortion into an issue that, earlier in the 70s, the Southern Baptist Convention had no issue with Roe v. Wade, but then by 79, 80s, and away we go. So this is, to me, Hell's Bells fits within a kind of long history of these sorts of productions. I think this fits into that. But I think we have to, the inductive method of reasoning and the logic that's happening here, I think is one thing that if we can't too quickly kind of dismiss, or because it's still active in lots of ways now. Like you can't, like that's the logic behind much of like the Gwen Shamblin stuff. That's the logic behind all sorts of things. And then the other piece that I think is acting here is the whole framing of like spiritual warfare. So like that opening thing of like the spiritual world is the real world. And by spiritual world, they mean like there's an active ongoing conflict between Satan and God.
As literal figures, and that like, heaven and hell are literal places.
Yes. I mean, I've heard you will hear megachurch pastors say this all the time. The reason we're getting so big is because heaven and hell are real places. If that's the case, then everything that's happening in your life and everything happening in the world around you immediately has an extra layer of explanation that you have to interpret it through. It's almost a form of conspiratorial thinking, and it paves the way for all sorts of panics.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like, I feel like code cracking of like, let's listen backwards to these lines of music. I feel like code cracking walked so conspiracy theories could run. I mean, we have very much still Satanic Panic tropes and ideas and literal anxieties existing today in the form of, the QAnon theory about the like global child sex trafficking ring and stuff.
Yeah.
So, which is also satanic.
Yeah. You say that these people can't, there's no sense of metaphor. So, every song is a literal song about something you should literally do. But at the same time, there is so much space for like almost improvisation. Like, and I think what's interesting is trying to figure out what is it, like, when does a particular argument about like spiritual warfare or something like that, when does it actually like work, or like when is it convincing and when is it not, right? Like when is it like, and I think in the documentary there are all these things that you see where, that you can track in other places, like the Aleister Crowley stuff and like the stuff that the Satanic Panic stuff about, these murders or these, whatever. But then there are lots of other things that like I'd only ever heard here, right?
Like, and so, what do you mean?
Like the idea that drug use was a form of sorcery.
Oh, really?
I'd never heard that before. All.
Whoa. Yeah.
I was just like, you don't do drugs, it's bad for your body.
Because I'm a little older than you, so I wonder if like my being steeped in this ambient societal Satanic Panic stuff, made me privy to that line of thought.
I mean, because I think like most of my understanding of drugs came from Dare, which was in the 90s and was about like, and that was built around, well, first of all, it was built around cops, and it was like legality, and it was about like harm to your body, and it was like in public school. So it wasn't this like,
Dare was around when Stranger Danger was around. And Say No to Drugs was around when the Satanic Panic was around.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And so I guess for me, the Satanic Panic and rhetoric and anti-drug rhetoric did kind of merge in a way that made me more familiar
Also,
with
on the Dare Wikipedia page, there's a picture of a Dare Pontiac Firebird, which is the most 90s thing I can think of. I lived in Durham, North Carolina for a good bit of my childhood, and I remember being told that, so two things about Durham, that it was a very dark place spiritually because of it was built all with tobacco money.
Oh, interesting. I thought you were going to say it's because of the research triangle.
No.
There's too many academics. There's too many universities corrupting the youth. That came later.
That came later.
That moral panic is alive and well now.
Yeah. No. Because it was built on the tobacco, and tobacco killed a lot of people.
I see.
The whole city had a spiritual negativity to it.
Interesting.
And then, on top of that, I was also told that Durham was very dark because there were a lot of Masons there, and the Masons were demonic. And that by darkness, they meant that like downtown Durham was very poor. But really, it was racism that made like Durham used to be like a financial hub for Black Americans, and it became like there's a story we could actually tell. So there's this way that like these narratives of spiritual warfare. I mean, you see it here. The 10,000% rise in crime that's claimed, that is with us, and so all of the time. Lots of people believe in invisible, unseen forces affecting their lives or the world around them. But why isn't this close reading?
For me, close reading as like a method of literary analysis and criticism is something that is going to take a sort of line by line kind of approach, but looking at it inside of a structural context. So it's going to look at syntax and phrasing and figurative language or whatever is happening inside of that line. And you could call that looking for deeper meaning or whatever.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I really love about close reading as a practice is just that it is going to take something small and put it into a structural context that gives you something else to help make sense of that thing.
Yeah.
So like in one of my classes, I have students do close readings of like monument rhetoric, little plaques that are on statues and things, because it's a very small amount of text, but each little piece of, they can take a phrase and then look at it as an example of lost cause rhetoric or whatever.
Right. Yeah. I think
that is to say, literal application has very little to do with it. It's,
right. Yeah.
So it's like, I think that what this guy is doing is saying, Robert Plant says in Stairway to Heaven that there are two paths that you can choose, but that's not true. There's one path. And it's like, I mean, okay. But do you know how, like, also two roads diverge in a wood or whatever? Yeah. Like, these roads are a metaphor that are used by lots of artists to talk about lots of things. Like,
there's this thing going on in the documentary that I thought was interesting, where they'll trace all the connections between, like, this lyric is connected to, Aleister Crowley, and Aleister Crowley did this, and then this, and then this. But then they'll go to, like, they'll quote a scripture, and they won't be like, and this scripture was written by Paul to a church in Corinth who was going through this during this period while this was. So there's a kind of historicization connection that happens on the one level, but not on the other. So while the kind of method in some ways is similar, like I can pull this quote out here and I can pull this quote out here, just like I do with the Bible. The assumption is like kind of the Bible is like this flat document that is just kind of all God's word.
Well, because it's also literal.
Right.
And so if we're doing a close reading of this film, for example, then it makes loads of sense that it would be needing, and this whole just kind of theological approach, it makes sense that there would be this attempt to find hidden meanings inside of our cultural media and the stuff that we make if what you believe is that there are these very literal, very real spiritual realms operating that we cannot access through our senses.
Yeah.
So if we believe that those things exist and that we are making things here in the world, then you have to read into what we're making in order to have them be relevant access points to what's happening spiritually.
Yeah, because like we kind of closed the Gwen Shamblin episode thinking about how like the kind of authoritarianism built into remnant church is like a kind of prep school for political authoritarianism in this way. We've kind of mentioned already, but there's a way that the spiritual warfare and the idea that there's always something else really going on. So like the whole world is backmasked, right, in a certain way, and that's like again the preparation for a kind of like conspiratorial thinking that when it's like putting these two things side by side, it's like, oh, I kind of understand a wave of modern conservatism. I don't know. I often find myself just being like frustrated at the way so many liberal intellectuals are dismissive of the kind of complexity. Like I don't want to praise this film as being some great piece of intellectual work, but I do think it is sophisticated and complicated, and I think too often a lot of folks dismiss it as just like simple and stupid. And I think like that's what Marsden was writing about in the 80s, and I think that's still a stream that we run into sort of all the time.
Well, I think a lot of those methods operate, per our Halloween theme, through a kind of fear factor logic.
Yeah.
It's why Jerry Falwell, among others, would talk in kind of blanket terms about the culture as some kind of broad scale, evil, energetic force that is out to corrupt the minds of our young people and take them to a literal hell. And it makes sense too then why there are things like hell houses and why those are so effective and why this kind of lyrical and symbolic text reading, that whatever kind of reading he's doing, whatever literary methods he's using to do so, are very much couched in what you should be afraid of. I'm going to read these for you so that I can show you exactly what you should be afraid of.
Right.
This is why they play the backmasking lines. First of all, I was wondering, maybe you have insight on this, like how much time and energy it took for them to listen.
I was wondering this too.
Did everybody just play every rock song in reverse and then
just turning turntables in reverse constantly?
But that like when he plays a line that has, an ostensible subliminal message, he plays it 3 times.
Yeah.
And it's like, listen to this one more time. Like, and again, one more time.
Also, if it was placed there by demons, wouldn't it be clearer?
I don't know. Maybe.
It's
right.
Like, I'm like,
right.
I would feel like Satan would be just like start smoking marijuana immediately.
One rock star, I forget who it was, but said at the time, like, if I'm going to put subliminal messages in my music, it'll be to like buy a bunch of copies.
Right. That's what I would do.
Right. Yeah. Like it's not going to be about Satan. It's going to be about.
It's like, I don't know if it was true or just like a urban legend about like they flash up like hidden popcorn images in movies and theaters to make you go buy popcorn in the middle of the theater. That's what I would do. Yeah.
One of the things that was happening in the late 80s and 90s as a backlash to these bands that were thought to be satanic and corrupting American youth was that there became this very large swath of like Christian heavy metal bands.
Oh yeah.
Did you ever listen to those?
I
Because it was like offered as like an alternative.
Yeah.
So you don't have to listen to Twisted Sister.
No.
Because you can listen to Striper or whatever.
Yeah. So when I came along, it was don't listen to Green Day, listen to MXPX.
Okay, sure.
Right?
Yours was the
first. I believe.
Yours was the alternative rock.
Yeah. Well, I was also much more emo than like I was.
That's
Stop
why.
nodding.
That's why.
I was, surprisingly or not, I was much more emo, and so it was. It was like. But I do think MXPX Life in General was the first CD I ever bought.
Did you call Three Doors Down emo?
No, that's a whole different thing.
I'm messing with you.
Yeah, no,
I'm messing with you.
No, but
that was a callback. That was a callback.
Well, no, but like I actually had a very I was going to talk about how I had like a very emotional experience listening to the live version of Stained and Fred Durst singing "Been a While" the other day, but that's neither here nor there. But it was the ability actually. I've referenced
so much energy.
I've referenced Jason Kirk's book before, Hell's World Without You.
Yeah,
and there's this great scene in the book where like you name your secular band, and I'll make sure I'll give you the Christian version that you can replace it with. So if you're like Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, I'm like Orange County Supertones, and you're like and you can just do it. So that was a skill that was cultivated. I think it just came later than all those bands.
Well, I mean, if you're going to separate yourself from the world, right?
Yeah.
If the world is
damn straight I am.
If the world is a thing that you see as operative in a certain way, reflecting the interests of dark forces, such that Christians are supposed to live like in but not of, isn't that the phrase?
Yeah.
You're in the world, but you're not of the world. And yet we are all so inevitably products of our societal moments.
Yeah.
I just think it makes loads of sense that there are these Christian counterparts to these like pop culture products that they don't want to consume, but they still need to make so that they can consume holier versions of it.
I think it's an idea of having as many on-ramps into your subculture as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If you happen to listen to this Christian metal song in lieu of like, Led Zeppelin, then you're going to hear the gospel because everything is spiritual. That's going to lead to you getting saved immediately. All of this.
Well, it's like the appeal that we talked about with Hillsong music. Like it is a Christian version and variant of mainstream pop music.
Yeah. But he doesn't endorse. There's no like, I was waiting for that at the end of the documentary of like, so here's what you can do.
Yeah.
He never, it's just like, no. So like, what am I supposed, like, I kind of all right, if I'm imagining myself as like a teenager watching this, what am I supposed to listen to?
Well, you're supposed to abstain though. Like, I mean, that's the whole thing, right? It's like abstinence only sex education. You can't teach safe sex with contraceptives. You can't give people tools to do something better. You have to just avoid it. Period. Like, I think that's part of that real, like the literal, heaven, hell, holy, sinful binary.
Yeah.
Is it like you have to just not?
I mean, at the very latest end of my experience in evangelicalism in the 2010s, there were still like, no, you should not listen to any, only listen. And that was also like, well, you guys also make the music, so you're going to get me to buy your music. But yeah, like it was like, this is, and I remember talking to younger people, like teenagers in their 20s, who were just like stressed, like felt guilty.
Sure.
About.
And that's nothing new. I mean, like there were music moral panics that were very steeped in white Christianity in the mid-century, like if you think post World War II, also when new technology was there because we had portable radios, like, there's Elvis and Little Richard and
Elvis gets a shout out here too. Yeah, for sure.
So there's, none of this is strange or different or new. It's all very Halloween appropriate, though.
It is very Halloween appropriate.
Do you have a takeaway?
I think it's about the way this mode of thought is sort of still very much with us. Like, I don't think that we're not in the midst of a satanic panic. We're not in the midst of, the idea of like satanic rock and roll music. There were moments, like there was the Lil Nas X video prompted
sure.
quite an outcry, but it was sort of short-lived and like a thing, right? But I think that the conspiratorial thinking and that framework is still there. And I think that like it's so weird to call it creative, but there's something about it that it's so generative of how people can see and it can be called upon in so many different ways. I think that's why it has endured in America in a particular way. It's like you can do so much with it. It's a very useful discursive kind of mode. And I think it warrants our attention because it has real effects that are sort of somatic, that are effective, that are political. I think it's very hard for people who aren't used to that mode of thinking, who aren't like if you've never prayed for a parking spot at the mall, I think it's hard to get your mind around like, what do I even do with that when you encounter it in somebody else?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. But like, I think that part of the reason that it is so generative and lasting is because the world is chaotic. Life often doesn't make sense. And there's always stuff that we're afraid of. So even if we're not praying for parking spots, we are consuming cult documentaries.
Yes.
For example.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a way in which the cult documentary genre as a just pop culture product and its appeal to people. I mean, I have said before that like I think that these documentaries make people feel better because they alleviate anxiety by showing people that seem wholly other to our own like kind of mainstream way of life. And I think that if we can operationalize by way of pop culture product and representation some kind of charismatic leader or kooky group of folks to be, if not afraid of, you should know that they're in your town. Cults are everywhere. They're waiting to prey on you. You don't wake up and think no one ever joins a cult. You can get sucked into a cult. Like, I don't know that I would call it broad scale moral panic in the way that the Satanic Panic was so focused. Right. And there were congressional hearings and budgets that were, put behind it. But I think that there is absolutely a ubiquitous and very frequent invocation of cults as something that are waiting to prey on people who are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of, why the genre exists.
But I think what's interesting is like most of the stuff we look at is, it's on HBO or Netflix, and it tends to be targeted at a kind of like, I don't know, like replacement level secular consumer.
Yeah, but it's people our age with, I mean, many people, definitely not me, but we'll have kids your age.
Yeah.
You have teenagers.
I do.
So like on one hand, it's speaking to a demographic who were just around at the time. Yeah. Like we were teenagers when Waco happened or whatever. Right. And so they're part of our just kind of cultural memory and there's nostalgia there.
Yeah.
And so we easily consume that. But there's also like a lot of middle-aged folks who were teenagers during the Satanic Panic are people who now have teenagers. And I don't know that that's like super strategic or whatever.
No.
But it like that's I don't know that any panics are like super strategic. I don't know.
But I think what's interesting here, though, is like this cult documentary is targeted at a particular Christian audience. Like, and that's why, I guess that's why I found part 5 so boring, is because like I'm convinced most people who watched this were already in church.
Sure.
Right. So it's like, but so it's like the scary people are like out there trying to trick you in particular. Like it's just a different orientation than when you're saying like, hey, we're all normal, look at the weirdos. It's like we're all saved, look at the Satanists.
Totally.
And the Satanists like outnumber us. So we're actually the chosen few.
Well, sure.
As opposed to like, look at that small group of weirdos. You know, and so I think that's the kind of like an interesting difference. But even if it's sort of at a kind of like formal level is kind of making the same pitch.
Well, that's the thing. Like, dress this video up. I mean, you wouldn't have to dress it up very differently, and it sounds a lot like the kinds of things that in other contexts are called cult leaders preying on their subgroup.
Yeah,
like, you know. Anyway.
Yeah. We need to keep a list of like things that keep like Aleister Crowley, Rosemary's Baby, things that keep coming up across these
refrains.
Yeah. What's your takeaway, Merinda?
It's to do with what we were just talking about. And it's to do with how we use fear and how we respond to fear, because conspiracy theories are obviously still operative in this moment in our time. It's like what I said with Black Christmas. Do you remember that movie?
Yeah.
That the call is always coming from inside the house. That is, I think, the takeaway. That's usually what happens. I think that the way that if we point to something to be afraid of that is really specific, like rock and roll or Satan in general, it keeps us like in relation to the Satanic Panic, it keeps us from thinking about the fact that the majority of instances of child and adolescent sex abuse is, you know, from the family or someone the family trusts.
Right.
If you're thinking about music, moral panics, like teenagers are going through a lot and they have a lot of depression and anxiety. Like those things are real. And I think it's easier to blame Satan than it is to deal with the realities of teenage mental health.
Yeah. Know? Yeah.
So that's one of my takeaways. The call is coming from inside the house. Another takeaway is that close reading is a craft that needs honed.
A witchcraft.
Hey! I mean,
The Craft, another film I wasn't allowed to watch.
I say often, much to my students' chagrin, like in the margins of their papers, you know, work on crafting your ideas at the sentence level. Close reading is a craft, man.
And to your point about the calls coming from inside the house, it's kind of proven true in that the number of people that are part of this kind of evangelicalism in this video is plummeting. So I don't know, especially young people. Like these churches have actually lost the young people they were so worried about.
But that's like there is a ready answer to that and rationale, right? Because like the world is stealing them, which allows there to still be a kind of like dominant political, cultural force of this moral majority that's, you know, responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade, etc. And for it to nonetheless cast itself as like the, you know, a marginalized group that really needs a lot of support and help. Like that level of like, we always need to work really hard because everything's going to be taken away. Mm-hmm. And this is like, that is its own fear-based logic that has, you know, made it a really powerful political presence.
Yeah. Christian Smith's title, Evangelicalism Embattled and Thriving. Right?
Yeah.
Although it's not really thriving anymore, I don't think, but we'll see.
Would you say not?
I think numerically it's...
I mean, sure.
Maybe
but
this
for
is just
as
me
long
talking.
As, again, I'm just like literally reproductive freedom was just taken away.
Right. No.
Federally.
Yes.
And so I don't know what the... You know what I mean?
I do, but I do think, and maybe this is just the story I tell myself.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at the demographic numbers and you look at things like the same demographic cliff that's headed towards universities where there's not going to be enough students of age to come to college, that's coming towards all the other institutions.
Numerically, yes, and they are still there. Yes, evangelicals, numerically, they are a increasing minority. Maybe.
So the same way liberal Protestantism literally died off.
Yeah.
Partially because they didn't have so many kids as evangelicals from like 60s to the 90s.
Right.
I think a similar thing is we see a rise in unaffiliated people, especially among religiously unaffiliated, especially among younger people. And I think what's going to happen in the next 20 years is that it's going to slowly die off, like quite literally. That's my theory. That's what makes me somewhat hopeful at night.
I mean, it is, I guess, what is true is that there is still an inordinate amount of power consolidated inside of a very small group of people.
And so while we're not, to your earlier point, while we're not experiencing a satanic panic, but a
subgroup is, like QAnon is.
Right. Yes. But I do think when you come to these cult documentaries and they're kind of they're the interest in them, it's often sort of post 2015, 2016, blah blah blah. I think that where this lands is like it's not a crisis of authority in the sense of like there's no authority. It's more of there is a deep anxiety about authority because of what you're saying. There's all this power concentrated.
Yeah.
And in that is not demographically or democratically supported. Representative. Yeah. And so maybe it could be, and so we are headed towards a place where we could be headed towards a place, if you want to kind of counter my argument, where yes, you're right. You're literally going to have kind of this form of evangelicalism die off. But the power will be so centralized that it won't matter, which is a very dark way to end this. Happy Halloween.
Well, I'll give you a cult favorite
what's your cult favorite?
That puts a smile on your face. So the 6th and final season of What We Do in the Shadows is premiering in just a few days from now. I guess maybe it'll be like a few days ago when this recording comes out, but on October 21st. And What We Do in the Shadows is a TV series that I'm sure a lot of listeners know about. It is from the brain trust of Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement of Flight of the Conchords fame in the latter case. Waititi is responsible for lots of brilliant things. Our Flag Means Death is one I think you know, right?
It's on my
it's on your list. Yeah.
I haven't.
They are the writer-directors of this. They had a film in 2014. Now it's a, series that has been around for some time. I had known about it. It had been on my list forever and ever, but I only recently started watching it. And it's like The Office, but for vampires. Like vampires, vampire roommates are living together and just getting into all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah.
Followed by a documentary film crew. And it's hilarious. It's super smart. It's so clever. High recommend.
All right.
For your Halloween watch if you are not a horror movie fan.
Yeah.
So.
No. It's literally on my list. So I'll have to remember that one.
And I mean they're only 30 minutes.
Yeah.
It's not a commitment.
My cult favorite, I took exception to the way Jerry Garcia was depicted in this documentary.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, do you know the Pizza Tapes?
Listen, man, the Grateful Dead and just jam bands in general is, they missed me.
Okay.
I don't know.
I had my jam era in college, and
do you like Dave Matthews Band?
No.
Come on.
I mean, I do, but like that wasn't my intro. My entree. I came in through the bluegrass jamgrass door in college, and my partner's next door neighbor, who was just one of those people that you never forget because they're just so idiosyncratic. Introduced one night, we go to his house. He's playing this. I just hear Amazing Grace. And I'm like, what is this? and it was the Pizza Tapes, which is this recording made by Jerry Garcia, Tony Rice, and David Grisman. And allegedly it was like a pizza delivery guy like somehow acquired the tapes, and that's how they got out, because it was just like a private jam session they were having. I don't know, but then they eventually got released.
I see.
But it's excellent, and I'm like, to any accusations that Jerry Garcia was a Satanist, I retort with his rendition of Amazing Grace, my favorite rendition of the song. There's also a really good version of Drifting Too Far from the Shore on there. So go listen to the Pizza Tapes and just kind of chill, everyone.
Sure, man.
Three Doors Down, MXPX, and Jerry Garcia. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to Cult Favorite. You can subscribe to the podcast on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And when you subscribe, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. You can also follow us on all the socials at Cult Favorite Pod. Give us feedback. Leave us a comment on this episode in Spotify, or DM us on one of the socials and let us know which of the songs we've mentioned do you like? What's your favorite Three Doors Down song?
We're never going to drop Three Doors Down. I don't know why that's the one I'm picking up, but I'm never going to put it down.
Special thanks to the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama for production assistance. If you're interested in pursuing an innovative master's degree that combines social theory and digital tools, look no further than the Religion and Culture Master's Program at the University of Alabama. The program is designed to equip students with sought-after analytical, communication, and digital skills that can be applied in any number of careers, while rigorous coursework and original research prepare students for prestigious PhD programs as well. We will see everybody. Not see, it's a podcast. We will be back.
We'll talk at you.
Bye.